The ballroom was filled with glamour and wealth, every detail meticulously planned for the most anticipated event of the year. It was impossible not to be dazzled by the glittering chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, the gleaming crystal glasses, and the lavish gowns that floated among the guests. At the center of it all, like a queen on her throne, was Clara, the wife of one of the city's richest and most influential businessmen, Ricardo. Her regal posture and calculated smile made her the focus of every gaze. But behind the brilliance and perfection, something dark was lurking beneath the surface. Clara, always proud of her status, moved among the guests as though the entire world revolved around her. She savored the admiring glances and empty compliments, even though deep down, she despised most of the people there. A fleeting smile of satisfaction crossed her lips when she overheard one of the businessmen's wives whisper, "Your dress is simply divine, Clara." She acknowledged it with a slight nod, not even bothering to remember the woman's name. Tonight, Clara felt untouchable, as though nothing could threaten her reign. The party continued with trivial conversations and endless glasses of champagne, but in the background, an almost invisible figure moved carefully. Laura, the new maid, had been working for Clara's family for a short time, and this was her first grand event. Her heart raced as she moved through the crowd, trying to keep her composure and avoid making any mistakes. Her simple uniform stood in sharp contrast to the opulence around her, but Laura was determined to blend into the background unnoticed. However, fate had other plans for her. As she carried a tray full of red wine glasses, her eyes wandered briefly, just for a second, anxious to serve without drawing attention. But in that fleeting moment, the inevitable happened. A slight stumble, and one of the glasses slipped from the tray, the crimson liquid spilling directly onto Clara's pristine dress. Time seemed to stop. The laughter and soft music that had filled the hall faded into an awkward silence. All eyes turned toward Clara, and to the vivid red stain now spreading across the expensive fabric. It was as if the air itself held its breath. With a withering stare, Clara locked eyes with Laura, and the fury in her gaze was palpable. "You idiot," she snapped, her voice echoing through the room. The crowd, paralyzed, watched in shocked silence, unsure of how to react. Laura, trembling, stammered out an apology, her voice barely audible. But Clara didn't let her finish. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Clara's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. "This dress is worth more than you'll ever make in your entire miserable life." The public humiliation seemed endless, and as Clara continued to unleash her fury, the discomfort in the room grew. Some guests let out nervous laughter, while others averted their gazes, pretending not to witness the scene. But Laura, her head bowed and hands trembling, felt something shift inside her. This was too much. She had endured enough. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet Clara's, and for the first time, there was no fear in her expression. "You can humiliate me all you want," Laura said, her voice calm yet unwavering. "But I know the truth behind that perfect facade of yours, Clara." Those words, spoken in a soft but firm tone, froze the room even further. Clara's confidence faltered for the briefest of moments. Her eyes widened, and a slight tremor passed through her lips. The murmurs began to spread among the guests, while Ricardo, who had been in conversation on the other side of the room, noticed the tension and approached. "What's going on here?" Ricardo asked, his brows furrowing as he looked from Clara to Laura, confusion shadowing his expression. Laura, her voice steady, answered without hesitation. "I know things that no one else here does. Secrets you'd rather never see the light of day." The impact of Laura's words was immediate. Clara tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out weak, lacking its usual conviction. The room, which had been filled with the sounds of merriment just moments before, was now thick with suspense. What did Laura know? Ricardo, still frowning, turned his gaze back to his wife, silently demanding an explanation, but Clara's composure was crumbling. For the first time that night, she appeared uncertain. "What is this, Clara?" Ricardo asked, his voice now cold and pointed. "What is she talking about?" Clara's smile faltered, her nerves betraying her. She laughed again, more out of desperation than confidence. This is ridiculous, Ricardo. She's just a maid trying to cause a scene. You can't take her seriously. But Clara's words no longer held the same power they once did. Laura's calm, unflinching gaze never wavered. You can try to silence me, Clara, she said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. But the truth has a way of coming out. A hush fell over the room as every guest waited, holding their breath, to see what would happen next. Clara's world, her meticulously built life of luxury and status, was starting to crumble, and for the first time in a long while, she had no control over the situation. Ricardo stared at his wife, his expression unreadable, as the weight of Laura's words hung in the air. Whatever was happening tonight, it was clear that nothing in their lives would ever be the same again. The tension in the ballroom was suffocating. The air was thick with curiosity, disbelief, and a sense of impending disaster. The guests whispered among themselves, trying to piece together what had just unfolded before their eyes. What could Laura possibly know that had shaken Clara so deeply? The powerful, untouchable Clara, always so composed, now looked pale and disoriented, her posture rigid and defensive. Ricardo, still stunned by the maid's bold words, stood in silence, his mind racing. His wife had never been challenged like this, not publicly, and certainly not by someone like Laura. He knew Clara too well. Her mask of elegance and control was starting to crack. And yet, it wasn't just the humiliation of a spilled drink that had unsettled her. It was something far deeper, something Laura knew. Laura, Ricardo said, his voice cutting through the hushed murmurs of the crowd.
What did you mean by that?
What is this truth you speak of? All eyes turned toward Laura, waiting for her to respond. Clara's eyes darted from Ricardo to Laura, a flicker of panic crossing her face. Her confidence, which had once been unshakable, was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Clara forced a brittle smile, her voice faltering as she tried to maintain her composure. Please, Ricardo, don't entertain this nonsense. She's just trying to make a scene, seeking attention. You know how these people are. I'm not lying, Laura interrupted, her voice firm and steady, refusing to be dismissed. I've seen things that no one here would ever believe. But I know the truth, and I think it's time that you do too, Ricardo. The room grew still, the murmurs fading as everyone focused on the unfolding confrontation. Ricardo's heart pounded in his chest, uncertainty clouding his judgment. He glanced at Clara, but her forced smile had vanished. Her eyes, once so full of control and power, now seemed to plead silently with him to stop this before it went too far. What is she talking about, Clara? Ricardo asked, his voice cold and demanding. I need to know what's going on.
Right now.
Clara straightened her back, her fingers clutching the fabric of her dress as if it were a lifeline. It's nothing, Ricardo. You're going to believe a maid over me? This is all just an attempt to. But Laura's calm voice cut through her frantic denial. Clara has been stealing from you. From your company. She's been moving money into secret accounts for years. I've seen the documents, the transfers, the meetings. She's used her position to manipulate you, to enrich herself behind your back. The revelation hit Ricardo like a blow to the chest. The guests gasped in shock, the room buzzing with disbelief. Clara's closest friends exchanged nervous glances, while others whispered in hushed voices, clearly unsettled by the accusation. The perfect image Clara had built over the years, her poise, her wealth, her status, was beginning to crumble, piece by piece. Clara's face drained of color, her lips parting in disbelief as Laura's words echoed in the room. You're lying, she stammered, her voice trembling. This is insane. Ricardo, don't listen to her. She's just... Is it true? Ricardo interrupted, his voice a low growl as he stepped closer to his wife. His eyes burned with fury and confusion, his mind spinning with the implications of what Laura had just revealed. Clara, is what she's saying true? Clara hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Ricardo to see the truth in her eyes. The momentary flicker of guilt, of fear, was unmistakable. And in that brief silence, Ricardo felt the ground beneath him give way. Everything he had believed, everything he had worked for, was now in question.
I
did it for us, Clara whispered, her voice shaking. Ricardo, you have to understand. The company was in trouble. I was just trying to protect what we built, what you built. I didn't want you to be burdened with the financial mess. I thought I could handle it on my own, that I could fix everything. Ricardo stared at her in disbelief, his heart pounding in his chest. By stealing from me? He asked, his voice full of hurt. By lying to me? Clara's eyes brimmed with tears, but Ricardo could no longer tell if they were real or just another part of the act she had perfected for so many years. I didn't mean to betray you, Ricardo, she pleaded, reaching out to him. I swear, I only did it for us, for our future. But Ricardo stepped back, pulling away from her touch. Don't, he said, his voice low and cold. Don't lie to me anymore, Clara.
Not now.
The guests around them watched in silence, some too stunned to react, others whispering furiously amongst themselves. The party, once filled with laughter and celebration, had turned into a spectacle of betrayal and broken trust. Laura stood quietly, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. She had known that exposing the truth would destroy more than just Clara's reputation. It would tear apart lives, rip through families, and unravel the illusion of perfection that Clara had carefully crafted. Ricardo's hands trembled as he looked at his wife, the woman he had once loved more than anything. The lies, the deceit, the betrayal, it was all too much. He turned to the crowd of guests, his voice heavy with emotion. I think this party is over, he said, his tone flat and final. The guests began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves, their eyes lingering on Clara's tear-streaked face as they left. The night, which had once been filled with glamour and celebration, had become something entirely different, something dark and irreversible. As the last of the guests disappeared, Clara sank into a chair, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The weight of her lies had finally caught up with her, and there was no turning back. Laura watched her from across the room, knowing that this was only the beginning of Clara's downfall. The house, once vibrant and alive with music and laughter, now felt empty. And in that emptiness, Ricardo stood alone, his mind racing with questions and regrets. His world had shattered in a matter of moments, and he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But as he turned to leave, one thought burned brightly in his mind. What else had Clara been hiding? The next morning, the once grand mansion was consumed by an eerie silence. The echoes of last night's revelations still lingered in the air, suffocating everything within its walls. Ricardo sat in his study, papers strewn across his desk, his thoughts a chaotic storm of memories, doubts, and betrayals. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, Clara's tear-streaked face haunted him, but it wasn't the tears that unsettled him. It was the lies beneath them. Her admission that she had stolen from him had been a shock, but now, as the sun rose and cast its pale light through the windows, Ricardo couldn't shake the feeling that there was more. So much more that he didn't know. He had spent years building his empire, carefully crafting a life that he thought was solid, unbreakable. But what was it all worth if it was built on deceit? His mind raced, going over every conversation, every moment he'd shared with Clara. How long had she been deceiving him? How deep did her lies run? The soft knock on his study door startled him. It was Laura. Sir, she said quietly as she stepped inside. She looked hesitant, almost guilty, as if she were carrying another burden. I didn't want to disturb you, but there's something else you need to know. I didn't tell you everything last night. Ricardo looked up, his heart already heavy with dread. What else is there, Laura? His voice was steady, but filled with a quiet urgency. After everything that had happened, he wasn't sure how much more he could take. Laura swallowed hard, her voice trembling slightly as she continued. Clara has been involved in more than just stealing money from the company. She's been manipulating people. Friends, employees, even you. And there's one more thing I overheard weeks ago. Something I didn't want to believe. Ricardo's pulse quickened, his gaze sharpening. What did you overhear? Laura hesitated, her eyes flickering with regret. She knew that what she was about to say would change everything, but she couldn't hold back the truth any longer. Clara has been seeing someone. It wasn't just about the money. There's been someone else, someone close to you. Ricardo's heart stopped for a moment. What? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
Who?
It's Simon, Laura confessed, her voice heavy with guilt. Your business partner. I overheard them late at night. They've been meeting in secret for months. At first, I thought it was just business, but then I heard the things they were saying. It was more than just work. It was personal. Ricardo felt the world tilt beneath him. Simon, his best friend, his most trusted ally, the man who had stood by his side through every success and every failure?
No.
It couldn't be true. It had to be a mistake. Simon would never betray him like that. He had been there since the beginning. They had built the company together. But as he stared at Laura, her eyes full of remorse, he knew she wasn't lying. The truth crashed down on him like a tidal wave, pulling him under. Are you sure? He asked, his voice raw with disbelief. I'm sure, Laura replied, her voice cracking. I didn't want to believe it either, but I saw them. I heard them. They've been plotting against you, Ricardo. Not just the affair, they've been siphoning money from the company. They're planning to take everything from you. Ricardo's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with tension. His entire life, his marriage, his business, his friendships, had been built on lies. The people he trusted most had been working behind his back, manipulating him like a pawn. And he had been blind to it all. How long has this been going on? He asked, his voice cold and distant, as if he were already detaching himself from the pain. At least a year, Laura whispered. Maybe longer. I don't know how deep it goes, but Simon, he's been helping her. They've been moving money, creating false deals. It's all a setup. Ricardo's breath came in shallow gasps. The betrayal cut deeper than he had ever imagined. How could he have been so blind? How could he have let this happen? He had spent his entire life building something that could be torn apart by the very people he trusted most. His mind raced with questions, but the one that kept repeating itself was why. Why had Clara done this? Why had Simon betrayed him? Was it greed? Power? Or something more personal? Laura stood silently, watching the man she had served for years crumble under the weight of the truth. She knew this revelation would break him, but she also knew that Ricardo was strong. He wasn't the type of man to sit back and let his world fall apart. He would fight back. He had to. I should have told you sooner, Laura said softly, her eyes filled with regret. I just didn't know how. Ricardo waved a hand, dismissing her apology. It's not your fault, Laura. You've done more than enough. He turned away from her, his eyes staring out the window at the city below. His mind was already spinning with thoughts of revenge, of justice.
He couldn't let this stand.
Clara and Simon had underestimated him. They thought they could play him, manipulate him. But they had no idea what they had started. I'm going to make them pay, Ricardo said quietly, more to himself than to Laura. For everything they've done. Laura nodded, her heart heavy. I'll help you, sir. In any way I can. Ricardo didn't respond. His mind was already racing ahead, planning his next move. He would need help. He couldn't take them down alone. But he had allies, people who owed him favors. People who could dig deeper than Simon or Clara ever anticipated. As Laura quietly left the room, Ricardo sat at his desk, his hands trembling with a mixture of fury and determination. Clara and Simon had torn his world apart, but they hadn't won. Not yet. He picked up his phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. The person on the other end was someone who operated in the shadows, someone who could help him uncover the secrets that Clara and Simon had buried so deeply. Victor, Ricardo said when the line connected. I need your help. It's time to get to work. The web of deceit was unraveling, but Ricardo knew that this was only the beginning. Clara and Simon had played their hand, but now it was his turn, and he wasn't going to let them win. The tension inside the mansion was suffocating. Clara was gone, but her presence lingered, like a dark shadow clinging to every corner of Ricardo's life. The truth of her betrayal had been devastating, but now, armed with the knowledge of Simon's involvement, the gravity of the situation felt even worse. Ricardo hadn't slept. His mind was a labyrinth of questions, and every path led to one conclusion. Everything he had built was at risk. It was late afternoon, but the sky was already darkening with thick, heavy clouds, a storm gathering in the distance. Ricardo stood by the window in his study, staring out at the approaching tempest. It mirrored the chaos that had become his life. For years, he had thought he was in control, the master of his own destiny. Now, it seemed like everything was slipping through his fingers. The sound of footsteps approaching pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Laura standing at the door, looking hesitant, as if she was unsure whether she should disturb him. "Sir, I've been going through some of the old records," she began, her voice low but steady. "There's something you need to see." Ricardo's brow furrowed as he motioned for her to come in. Laura stepped forward, holding a thick folder in her hands. She placed it on his desk, her eyes filled with concern. "I found these in Clara's private office," she explained. "They're contracts, financial documents, but some of them don't make sense. The signatures, the dates, it's like she was manipulating things from behind the scenes long before we ever suspected." Ricardo's heart sank as he opened the folder, scanning the documents. His stomach twisted as the pieces began to fall into place. Clara had been more than just careless with money. She had been orchestrating a deliberate and calculated plan to siphon resources from the company, to build her own empire, and she had done it all right under his nose. And Simon. Simon had been there every step of the way, ensuring that Clara's scheme stayed hidden, feeding Ricardo just enough information to keep him in the dark. This was all planned, Ricardo muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. Every move, she knew exactly what she was doing. Laura nodded, her expression grim. "It's worse than we thought. Clara wasn't just stealing money, Ricardo. She was setting you up to fail. She and Simon, they were preparing to take over the company. The deals they were making, the partnerships they were forming, it was all designed to push you out." Ricardo's fists clenched as the full weight of the betrayal settled on him. Clara had been playing the long game, and she had nearly won. He had trusted her, trusted Simon, and they had both used that trust against him. But they hadn't counted on Laura. They hadn't counted on someone who had been watching, listening, piecing together the puzzle that Clara had so carefully constructed. "I should have seen this coming," Ricardo said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have known." "Sir, there's no way you could have predicted this," Laura said gently. Clara and Simon, they're both master manipulators. They knew how to cover their tracks. But now we know the truth, and we can stop them. Ricardo took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The rage boiling inside him was almost too much to bear, but he knew that if he let it consume him, he would lose everything. He couldn't afford to be reckless.
Not now.
"We need more evidence," Ricardo said after a long pause. "If we're going to take them down, we need to expose everything. I want every document, every communication they've ever shared. I want to know every deal they made, every person they lied to." Laura nodded. "I'll keep digging. There's more. I'm sure of it." As she turned to leave, Ricardo's phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced down and saw Victor's name flash on the screen. His heart rate quickened as he answered the call. "Ricardo," Victor's gravelly voice came through the line. "I've got news." "What is it?" Ricardo asked, already bracing himself for more bad news. "I've been looking into Simon, just like you asked. It's worse than we thought. He's been making moves behind her back for months, maybe even years. He's got his hands in everything, business deals, offshore accounts, even political connections. Clara may have been the mastermind, but Simon's the one pulling the strings." Ricardo's blood ran cold. Simon, the man he had trusted more than anyone, the man he had built his empire with, was the real puppet master. "I want to take him down," Ricardo said, his voice hard. "I want to destroy everything he's built." "We'll get there," Victor reassured him. "But it's going to take time. Simon's smart. He's covered his tracks well. But I've already got some leads. I'll keep digging." Ricardo hung up the phone, his mind spinning. He couldn't believe how deep the betrayal went. Clara had been the face of the deception, but Simon had been the architect, pulling the strings from behind the curtain. He stood up from his desk, pacing the room, his thoughts racing. He couldn't let them win. He couldn't let everything he had built crumble because of their greed and ambition. As the storm outside grew darker, Ricardo knew that the real battle was just beginning. Clara and Simon had underestimated him. They had thought they could manipulate him, use him, and then discard him when they were done. But they were wrong. He was going to fight back, and when the dust settled, they would be the ones left standing in the wreckage of their own making. The storm was coming, and Ricardo was ready. The morning after the shocking revelations, Ricardo stood at his office window, watching the sun rise over the city. It should have felt like a new beginning, a fresh start after the lies and betrayals that had torn his world apart. But instead, it felt like a countdown, a ticking clock that warned him things were about to get much worse. His mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, and as the golden sunlight bathed the skyline, Ricardo couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had transpired. Clara's betrayal, Simon's manipulation, it all made him question every decision he had made. How could he have trusted them for so long? How could he have allowed them to sink their claws so deeply into his life? But that wasn't where his mind could stay.
Not now.
This wasn't the time for self-doubt or regret. He had to act, and fast. He was about to make his first move when his phone buzzed on the desk. He grabbed it, his heart pounding as Simon's name flashed across the screen. For a moment, Ricardo considered ignoring the call. He didn't want to hear any more lies. But something inside told him this was important, that Simon had something up his sleeve. He answered, his voice cold and distant. "Ricardo." Simon's voice came through the line, smooth and confident as ever. "I've been meaning to talk to you. I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Save it." Ricardo cut him off, his voice sharp. "I know everything. About you. About Clara. About the money you've been stealing. So don't bother trying to twist this around." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Simon wasn't used to being confronted, especially not by Ricardo. But his arrogance quickly resurfaced. "Ricardo, you've got it all wrong. Whatever Laura told you, she's lying. She's trying to turn you against me." Ricardo gripped the phone tighter, his patience wearing thin. "Laura didn't lie. She's the only one who's been honest with me through this whole mess. But you betrayed me, Simon. And you think you can get away with it?" Simon chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down Ricardo's spine. "You think I'm the only one involved, Ricardo? You think this stops with me? There's a lot more going on here than you realize. Clara may have left, but she's not done. And if you don't play your cards right, she'll take everything from you before you even see it coming." Ricardo's pulse quickened. He knew Simon was right. Clara was far from finished. But the way Simon spoke, so calm, so assured, made it clear that this wasn't just about revenge or power. There was something much bigger at stake. "You should have stayed loyal," Ricardo said, his voice steady but filled with fury. "Now you've left me no choice." Simon laughed again, the sound darker this time. "Do what you need to do, Ricardo. But you're already playing a losing hand." The line went dead, leaving Ricardo staring at the phone in disbelief. The conversation left him feeling more unsettled than ever. He had known Clara was dangerous, but Simon's words hinted at connections and alliances that went beyond what Ricardo had imagined. Taking them down wouldn't be as simple as he had hoped, but he wasn't going to give up. He had resources of his own and people who still stood by him. If Clara and Simon thought they could outmaneuver him, they were in for a rude awakening. A few hours later, Ricardo stood outside a private building in a quiet part of the city. The man he was about to meet had helped him in the past, someone who operated in the shadows, dealing with situations when the law couldn't. His name was Victor, a former investigator with a reputation for uncovering the dirtiest secrets and exposing people for who they really were. Victor's office was dimly lit, and the air inside was thick with the scent of old books and cigarette smoke. Ricardo sat across from him, explaining everything. The betrayal, the stolen money, and now the threat Simon had made. Victor listened silently, his sharp eyes never leaving Ricardo's face. When Ricardo finished, Victor leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long puff of smoke. "You've got yourself in a deep mess, Ricardo," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But you're right. Clara's not just after your money. She's playing a bigger game. Ricardo nodded, his jaw tight with frustration. What can I do? How do I stop her? Victor tapped the ash from his cigarette into a tray, considering the question. You're not going to like this, but you're going to have to play dirty. Clara's got connections, probably pulling strings behind the scenes. You need to find out who she's working with, expose them, and use it against her. If you can cut off her allies, she won't have the power to hurt you anymore. Ricardo leaned forward, his determination growing. How do I do that? Victor stood, walking over to a filing cabinet in the corner. He pulled out a thick folder and handed it to Ricardo. This is a list of people I've been keeping an eye on, people with questionable ties. I'll start digging into Clara's background, see who she's been meeting with. But you'll need to watch your back. Simon and Clara are dangerous, and they won't hesitate to make things personal. Ricardo took the folder, his fingers tightening around it. I'm ready. Whatever it takes to stop them, I'll do it. Victor nodded, a small smirk playing on his lips. That's the spirit. But remember, Ricardo, once you start down this road, there's no turning back. Make sure you're prepared for whatever comes next. Ricardo left Victor's office feeling more resolute than ever. He wasn't going to let Clara or Simon win. Not now, not ever. They had underestimated him, thought they could manipulate him like a puppet. But now, he was going to turn the tables. He had the resources, the connections, and soon he would have the information he needed to destroy them both. As he drove back to the mansion, Ricardo couldn't help but wonder what Clara's next move would be. She was a master manipulator, always one step ahead. But this time, he was ready for her. And when the time came, he would make sure she felt the full weight of her betrayal. As Ricardo sat in the back seat of his car, watching the city rush past, he could feel the weight of the decisions he'd made pressing down on him. His mind was racing, replaying the conversation with Victor over and over. He had committed to the plan. There was no turning back. Clara and Simon had woven a web of deceit that had ensnared him, but he was about to rip it apart, thread by thread. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving faster than he had anticipated. Every second counted now. His phone buzzed again, breaking the heavy silence in the car. It was Victor. Ricardo answered immediately, his voice steady but anxious. What's the update? I've been digging, just like you asked, Victor said, his voice rough over the line. Clara's been in contact with more people than we realized. She's been smart, using intermediaries, people who wouldn't seem connected at first glance. But I found something big, Ricardo. Something that might be the key to taking her down. Ricardo's heart quickened. Tell me. There's a man, Victor continued. Someone with deep pockets and a lot of influence. His name is Marcus. Clara's been meeting with him for months, long before you even suspected anything. He's a major player in the corporate world, ties to politicians, high-level business deals, and more than a few shady operations. Whatever Clara's planning, it's tied to him, Marcus. The name echoed in Ricardo's mind. He'd heard of Marcus, his reputation was as cold as steel, and he was not a man you crossed lightly. If Clara was working with him, then this went deeper than Ricardo had imagined. This wasn't just about stealing money or power. This was about destroying everything he had built. How do we use this against her? Ricardo asked, his voice low and dangerous. Victor paused for a moment, as if considering the weight of his next words. We need proof of their dealings. I've got contacts who can help us get what we need, phone records, emails, financial transfers. But it's risky, Ricardo. We're playing with fire here. If Marcus finds out we're onto him, things could get ugly. Ricardo's jaw clenched. I don't care about the risk. We need to stop them. Clara and Marcus can't get away with this. Victor sighed, knowing Ricardo was right. I'll make the calls. We'll get the proof. But once we have it, you need to be ready to act. This isn't just about outmaneuvering them in a boardroom. You're going to have to go all in. I'm ready, Ricardo said firmly. Whatever it takes. As he hung up, Ricardo felt a surge of adrenaline course through him. He knew the next few days would be critical. He needed to stay sharp, stay focused. Clara had already made her move, and now it was his turn. He wasn't going to wait for her to strike again. That night, back at the mansion, Ricardo sat at his desk, reviewing the information Victor had sent over. It was a puzzle, a tangled mess of transactions, communications, and meetings. But slowly, the pieces were coming together. Clara had been meticulous, covering her tracks with layers of deception, but no plan was perfect. And now, Ricardo had the tools to expose her. Just as he was about to call it a night, a knock came at the door. His heart skipped a beat. It was unusual for anyone to disturb him this late. He stood up, his pulse racing, and opened the door cautiously. Laura stood there, her face pale but determined. "Laura," Ricardo said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" She glanced around nervously before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you. It's about Clara." Ricardo motioned for her to come inside, closing the door behind her. "What is it? What have you found out?" Laura took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "I've overheard some things. Clara's been talking to someone on the phone late at night when she thought no one was listening. She mentioned Marcus. She's planning something, Ricardo. Something big. And I'm afraid it's going to happen soon." Ricardo's chest tightened. "Did you hear anything specific? Anything we can use?" Laura hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I heard her mention a meeting. It's happening tomorrow night. I don't know the details, but I know she's meeting with Marcus in secret. If we can find out what they're planning, we might be able to stop it." Ricardo's mind raced. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, a chance to catch Clara in the act. But it was also dangerous. If he went to that meeting unprepared, it could backfire. "Thank you, Laura," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've done more than you know. We'll stop them." Laura gave him a tight nod before slipping out of the room, leaving Ricardo alone with his thoughts once more. He knew what he had to do. The next night, everything would come to a head. The following evening, Ricardo found himself parked outside an upscale restaurant on the edge of the city. He watched from a distance as Clara entered, dressed to the nines, her confident demeanor hiding the treachery underneath. He could feel his pulse pounding in his temples, the anticipation gnawing at him. He wasn't alone. Victor had his team positioned nearby, ready to document everything. Time ticked by slowly, every second stretching into eternity. Finally, a sleek black car pulled up and Marcus stepped out. The man radiated power, his every movement calculated, his expression as cold as ice. Ricardo gripped the steering wheel tightly. This was it. Inside the restaurant, Victor's team had already begun recording. They captured every word exchanged between Clara and Marcus, their plans, their schemes, their betrayal. And now, Ricardo had the proof he needed. As he sat there, watching the two of them plot his downfall, Ricardo felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had been through hell these past few months, but now, he had the upper hand. Clara and Marcus had no idea what was coming for them. Ricardo dialed Victor's number. "We've got them," he said, his voice steady. Victor's reply was filled with satisfaction. "Good. Now it's time to bring this all crashing down." As Ricardo hung up the phone, he took one last look at the restaurant. The endgame was here, and this time he wasn't going to lose. Ricardo stood in the dimly lit hallway of his mansion, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Tonight would change everything. He could feel it in his bones. Clara and Marcus thought they had outsmarted him, that they could play their game of deception and come out on top. But they had underestimated him. They had no idea that every move they made had been watched, every lie they told was about to unravel. The evidence Victor's team had gathered was ironclad. The recordings of Clara and Marcus plotting against him were damning. He had listened to every word, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and determination. Now the time had come to strike. Ricardo wasn't going to let them get away with it. As he paced the room, Ricardo glanced at the clock on the wall. In less than an hour, Clara and Marcus would meet again. This time, though, they wouldn't be meeting in secret. They would be walking right into a trap. He picked up his phone and called Victor. "Everything is in place." Victor's voice crackled on the other end of the line. "We're ready. My team is on site, and we've got eyes on Clara. She's on her way to the meeting. Marcus is already there." "Good," Ricardo said, his voice steady. "Make sure they don't know anything's wrong until it's too late." "Don't worry," Victor replied with a slight chuckle. "They won't suspect a thing. By the time they realize what's happening, It'll be over. Ricardo hung up and took a deep breath. The calm before the storm. Everything had led to this moment. The lies, the betrayals, the sleepless nights. Clara had once been the love of his life, someone he thought he could trust. But now, she was the enemy, and Ricardo couldn't afford to let emotions cloud his judgment. He had to be cold, ruthless. As Ricardo drove toward the meeting location, his mind replayed the events of the past few weeks. Clara had been so careful, so meticulous in her deception. But greed and arrogance had been her downfall. She had left just enough breadcrumbs for Ricardo to follow, and now he was about to turn the tables. When he arrived at the upscale hotel where the meeting was set to take place, Ricardo parked a few blocks away and made his way inside through a discreet side entrance. The air was thick with tension, and every step he took felt heavier than the last. He could see the restaurant from the hallway, and through the large glass windows, he spotted Clara sitting at a corner table, her posture poised and confident as always. Marcus was next to her, his expression unreadable as they exchanged hushed words over glasses of wine. Ricardo's heart raced, but he kept his composure. This was it. Victor's team was positioned discreetly around the room, capturing everything. Ricardo's eyes narrowed as he watched Clara laugh at something Marcus said, the sound muffled but infuriating all the same. She was still playing her role perfectly, as though nothing could touch her. But she didn't know what was coming. Ricardo stepped forward, moving into the room with purpose. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of Clara and Marcus. Their conversation faltered, and Clara's eyes widened as she saw him. For a brief second, her mask of confidence cracked, but she quickly recovered, a smirk forming on her lips. "Ricardo," Clara said smoothly, her voice laced with false warmth. "I wasn't expecting you. What brings you here?" Ricardo didn't flinch. "I think you know exactly why I'm here." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze darting between Ricardo and Clara. He could sense that something was wrong, but he wasn't sure what. Clara leaned back in her chair, her smirk deepening. "Oh, come now, darling. You've been so stressed lately. Why don't you join us? We're just having a nice little chat about business." Ricardo's jaw tightened. "Business, huh? You mean the business of trying to destroy everything I've worked for? The business of stealing from me and plotting behind my back?" Clara's smirk wavered for a fraction of a second. "Ricardo, you've got it all wrong. I don't know what you think you've heard, but..." "I've heard everything," Ricardo interrupted, his voice cold as ice. "I know all about the meetings, the money transfers, the deals with Marcus. I know how you've been manipulating me from the start. And I've got proof." Marcus' face paled, his calm demeanor vanishing. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to sound innocent, but the fear in his voice betrayed him. Ricardo didn't take his eyes off Clara. "You should have known better, Clara. You should have realized that eventually, the truth would come out. You've been playing a dangerous game, and now it's over." Clara's expression hardened, the mask slipping entirely now. She glared at Ricardo, her eyes flashing with anger. "You think you can stop me?" she hissed. "You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with, Ricardo." "Oh, I think I do," Ricardo replied calmly. "And so do they." At that moment, the doors to the restaurant opened, and Victor's team of investigators walked in, followed by law enforcement officers. Clara's eyes darted around the room in panic as they approached the table. Marcus stood up abruptly, knocking over his glass of wine in the process. "This is a mistake," Marcus shouted, but his voice wavered. "You have no right." "We have every right," Victor said, stepping forward with a satisfied smirk. "We've got all the evidence we need. The deals, the transactions, the recordings. It's all here, and you're both going down." Clara's face twisted in fury. She turned to Ricardo, her voice filled with venom. "You think this is over? You think you've beaten me? I'll ruin you, Ricardo. I'll make sure you lose everything, just like you're trying to do to me." Ricardo stood his ground, meeting her gaze with steely resolve. "You already lost, Clara. You just don't know it yet." As Clara and Marcus were taken into custody, Ricardo felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. It was done. The trap had been set, and they had walked right into it. Clara's reign of deception was finally over. But as he watched them being led away, Ricardo couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Clara was dangerous, and even now, she might have one last trick up her sleeve. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. As he stepped out of the restaurant, the cool night air hit his face, and Ricardo allowed himself a moment to breathe. He had taken the first step in reclaiming his life, but he knew that there were still more challenges ahead. Clara wasn't someone who gave up easily. And if there was one thing Ricardo had learned through all of this, it was that the most dangerous enemies were the ones who struck when you least expected it. He would be ready for her. Ricardo paced back and forth in his mansion's grand hallway, the heavy air of the past few days weighing on him. The events at the restaurant played over and over in his mind like a broken record. Clara's furious gaze as she was led away in handcuffs, Marcus's pale, terrified face. It should have brought him satisfaction, but something inside him wouldn't let him rest. He knew Clara too well. This wasn't over. He stared out the window, watching the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. There was an eerie stillness in the air, a sense that the storm was coming. Victor had reassured him that everything was under control, that the evidence was enough to convict both Clara and Marcus for their crimes. But Ricardo couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something, that Clara had another trick waiting to spring at the last moment. The ringing of his phone broke through the silence. Ricardo glanced at the screen and saw Victor's name. His heart raced as he answered. "Victor? What's going on?" Victor's voice was calm, but laced with urgency. "Ricardo, I just got word from my team. There's been movement on Clara's accounts. Something we didn't expect." "What do you mean, movement?" Ricardo demanded, already feeling the knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "She's been transferring assets, funneling money through accounts we hadn't traced before. Offshore. It's all hidden, buried under layers of false identities and shell companies. She must have set it up before we even caught her." Ricardo's blood ran cold. He knew Clara was ruthless, but this level of planning, it was something only a master manipulator would pull off. "How much money are we talking about?" "Enough to cripple your company if she uses it the right way," Victor said gravely. "It's clear she was prepared for this outcome." "She's not done yet, Ricardo. She's got resources stashed away, and if she decides to make her next move, you're still at risk." Ricardo gripped the phone tighter, his mind racing. Clara had played the long game, anticipating every possible outcome. Even with her behind bars, she had managed to maintain control. But he couldn't let her win. Not now, not after everything she'd done. "Can we stop her?" Ricardo asked, his voice hardening with resolve. "We can track the funds, but it'll take time," Victor replied. "We've got people working on it, but you need to be ready. Clara is going to come at you one last time, and when she does, it won't be just about money. She's going to try to destroy your entire legacy." Ricardo's chest tightened as the weight of Victor's words sank in. Clara was about to launch her final attack, and he knew it wasn't just his company that was at stake. It was his name, his reputation, everything he had built. Clara wanted to burn it all to the ground. Victor's voice broke through his thoughts. "I'll keep you updated. We're closing in on her accounts, but you need to prepare for anything." "Thanks, Victor," Ricardo muttered, hanging up the phone. He stood in the middle of the hallway, staring at the ornate chandelier hanging above him. Everything around him, the mansion, the wealth, the power, it was all within Clara's reach, even now. She could still rip it away from him with a single, calculated move. He couldn't let that happen. As the evening wore on, Ricardo found himself back in his office, surrounded by documents, trying to anticipate Clara's next move. He knew she wouldn't stop at draining the accounts. No, she wanted something bigger, total ruin. He stared at the files in front of him, his mind turning over every possibility, every angle. Then it hit him. The media. Clara would use the media to turn the tide against him, to make him look like the villain in all of this. She had always known how to manipulate the public, how to twist the truth in her favor. And now, she would be preparing to go on the offensive, spinning a story that would make her look like the victim, while Ricardo became the ruthless, vengeful businessman who had betrayed her. He picked up his phone and dialed Victor again. "Victor, listen. I need to get ahead of this. Clara's going to use the press against me. We need to control the narrative before she does." Victor sighed on the other end of the line. You're right. She'll play the victim card and try to turn public opinion. I'll get my PR contacts working on it, but you'll need to make a statement, something that shows the truth before she can twist it. Ricardo leaned back in his chair, already thinking about how to frame his response. He would have to walk a fine line. Be honest without revealing too much, show strength without appearing heartless. Clara was counting on him making a mistake, but he wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Do whatever you have to, Victor. I'll be ready. After ending the call, Ricardo spent the rest of the night drafting his public statement. It had to be perfect, a precise mix of transparency and strength. He wasn't going to let Clara paint him as the villain in her twisted narrative. The next morning, as he prepared to release the statement to the media, another call came in. This time it was his lawyer. Ricardo, you're not going to believe this. Clara's legal team is already moving to counter your claims. They're saying you orchestrated everything, that you set her up to take the fall. Ricardo clenched his jaw, rage bubbling beneath the surface. Clara was already striking back, using every dirty tactic she could. But he wasn't surprised. He had expected this. It doesn't matter, Ricardo said, his voice cold. I've got the truth on my side. And soon, the whole world will know what she did. Hours later, Ricardo's statement went public. It was carefully crafted to expose Clara's manipulations, highlighting the evidence against her while maintaining a tone of professionalism. The media pounced on the story, eager to dig into the drama that had unfolded between the two once powerful partners. As the news spread, Ricardo kept a close eye on the headlines, waiting for Clara's response. But the more he read, the more he realized that the tide was turning in his favor. The evidence was too damning, too overwhelming for Clara to overcome. No matter what story she spun, the truth was out there now. That evening, as Ricardo sat in his office, watching the sunset cast a golden glow over the city, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: relief. Clara's empire of lies was crumbling, and for the first time, Ricardo saw a future where he could rebuild, stronger than ever before. But deep down, he knew that Clara wouldn't disappear quietly. There was still one more battle left to fight. And when it came, Ricardo would be ready to make his final move. The storm had come and gone, but the echoes of it still lingered in the air. Clara was out there, plotting her next step. But Ricardo had survived the worst of it, and he knew that whatever came next, he would be ready. He wasn't just playing defense anymore. Now, it was time to strike back.